Yeah, I'm Peter Jonathan Hatch, and I served as the Director of Gardens and Grounds at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello between 1977 and 2012. And I served in that role by taking care of Thomas Jefferson's 2,400 acres that was owned by the private foundation that owns Monticello, and I restored Jefferson's gardens to the way he had them on top of the mountain that he called a little mountain, Monticello, which means little mountain. And I developed a lot of educational programs that used Thomas Jefferson and used the gardens to uncover a lot of interesting features of the world of Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson's interest in gardening and horticulture really arose from this wide-eyed curiosity about the natural world. He cited Monticello for its intimacy with what he called the workhouse of nature, and he wrote, "How sublime to look down upon the workhouse of nature, clouds, thunder, lightning, all fabricated at our feet." But he was an avid and wide-eyed vegetable gardener. One could perhaps say that he was an experimenter. Jefferson once wrote that the greatest service which can be rendered any country is to add a useful plant to its culture. And the staggering number of ornamental and useful plants that Jefferson documented growing at Monticello is truly remarkable. He documented some 330 varieties of 89 different species of vegetables and 170 varieties of the finest fancy fruit that was known in the early 1800s. When visitors came to Monticello, they were given tours of what one visitor referred to as Mr. Jefferson's pet trees, and he mentioned planting some 160 different species of trees at Monticello. Monticello was a botanic garden, an experimental station of new and unusual plants that came literally from the four corners of the globe. It was literally an Ellis Island, if you will, of new and unusual plants. And Jefferson was very much sort of a seedy missionary, as he'd get unusual plants from great plantsmen from around the world, and he'd share them with his friends, family, neighbors, but also some of the leading plantsmen of the early 1800s. Jefferson looked at plants as sort of a vehicle for social change. When he was president of the United States, he had a blind tasting of salad oils to see which salad oil people liked the best. He was, of course, primarily a vegetarian. He wrote that he ate meat only as a condiment to his meals, while vegetables provided the main component of his diet. And people liked the sesame oil in this blind tasting better than any other salad oil, so that set off this sort of mad Jeffersonian obsession in growing sesame year in and year out in his kitchen or his vegetable garden. He devised 3 different presses in order to extract an oil from the seed. But he looked at this plant as a way of transforming the young American republic, the democracy of the United States of America. Jefferson's vegetable garden was remarkable. It was 1,000 feet long. There's 3 football fields. It was carved out of the side of the mountain by 7 slaves that Jefferson hired from a Fredericksburg, Virginia farmer. And over a period of 3 years, as Jefferson was about to leave the presidency, they moved some 600,000 cubic feet of earth in order to create what was one person called a hanging garden. It was a plateau carved out of the side of the hillside. And the really remarkable feature of the garden is its microclimate. It faces to the southeast and captures this wealth of crop ripening sunshine and enabled Jefferson to extend the growing season through the winter months and to start things really early in the springtime. And this was a garden, it was really the garden of Jefferson's retirement years. Between the ages of 67 and 83, between 1809 when he left the presidency until his death in 1826, this garden was sort of a measure of Jefferson's vitality. To be able to go out into the garden and sow peas or write in his garden diary when his salsify was harvested in October of 1814 was kind of an expression of youthful vitality for him. Jefferson once wrote that, "Although an old man, I am but a young gardener." And even at the age of 81 years old, he read about 7-foot-long cucumbers in a Cleveland, Ohio newspaper. So he wrote the governor of Ohio and asked him for seeds of this special variety of cucumber, sowed the seeds in his garden, measured how long each one was, passed seeds out to his neighbors in Charlottesville, Virginia. And by saying that he was an old man but a young gardener, you get a sense of his almost youthful, wide-eyed innocence when it came to the gardening process, even as a 81-year-old man. Jefferson kept a remarkable diary called the Garden Book of his gardening adventures at Monticello. It's some 71 pages long and is bound in leather and resides today at the Massachusetts Historical Society. And people can go to their computers and Google Jefferson's Garden Book and read this remarkable document online. It's really kind of a chilling experience. But one sees in the Garden Book Jefferson as sort of this garden scientist, counting up how many Carolina beans, which would fill a quart jar, which would in turn plant so many feet of row in his garden. You also can't help but notice Jefferson's unflinching attention to seeds not coming up and crops failing and other disasters of the gardening world. And one could perhaps say that few gardeners failed as often as Jefferson. Few gardeners killed as many plants as Thomas Jefferson. But you could also say that few gardeners had as much fun as Thomas Jefferson. He wrote that in gardening, it's the failure of one thing that is repaired by the success of another. And his indefatigable enthusiasm overcame sort of sometimes the weather or the droughts or too much rain or insects that riddled his cabbage plants. One year Jefferson got a letter from his daughter Martha when he was serving as Secretary of State in Philadelphia. And she complained to her father about the insects ravaging her cabbage plants as fast as she could set them out in the vegetable garden at Monticello. And Jefferson wrote back to his daughter and said, well, the problem with the plants is that they're growing in poor soil. And he said, the two of us next winter are going to cover the entire garden with a heavy coating of manure. When plants are growing in rich soil, he wrote, they will in turn, in Jefferson's words, bid defiance to all sorts of pests, diseases, droughts, and all the things that afflict a gardener in central Virginia during a long, hot summer. So Jefferson had this balanced belief between wild nature on the one hand and the cultivated garden. He really worked with the natural world, even in terms of combating insect problems by incorporating organic matter into the soil to build a rich and fertile soil in Monticello. Jefferson also is fascinating to learn that he also used plants not just as a vehicle for social change, but also as a vehicle, a way of relating to friends, family, and neighbors. He used plants as a way of relating to people. Throughout the letters that have been published in Jefferson's Garden Book, there's this constant garden gossip as he would chide his granddaughters for their inattention to the wallflowers around the house, while they in turn would relate to their grandfather the latest gardening dramas that were taking place at Monticello. Jefferson had contests with his neighbors to see who could bring the first English pea to table in the springtime, the winners hosting the losers over for a community supper that included a feast on the winning dish of peas. And the family legend is that Jefferson rarely won the pea contest in the springtime. He had a neighbor, a man named George Divers, who pretty much regarded himself as the king of the pea contest. And in 1814, the family story goes, Jefferson actually brought the first English pea to table, but refused to divulge the fact to Mr. Divers in fear of rocking the pride of his very good friend. There are a lot of different kinds of gardens at Monticello. There's the vegetable garden that I mentioned. There was a 400-tree orchard. There were 2 vineyards. There was a grove, which was an ornamental forest that was carved out of the forests at Monticello. There were flower beds around the house, and Jefferson's overseer wrote that the flower gardens bloomed virtually every month of the year. So there's a lot of diversity to Jefferson's passion for the gardening world. And at Monticello, we began restoring the gardens in the early 1940s, really. The flower gardens were put back by the Garden Club of Virginia. Jefferson had a lovely image for the flower gardens at Monticello. He compared them to the acts in a play. And he would write about how the tulips would come up, perform their show, and be replaced later in the season by the irises. And the irises would do their thing and receive their applause and be replaced later in the season by the lilies. He referred to the flowers themselves as being like what he called the belles of the day, who after flowering retire to the more interesting office of reproducing their like. Jefferson would often get very poetic when he'd write about gardening, particularly when he was in his gardens with his daughters and his granddaughters. Jefferson's granddaughter, Ellen Randolph Coolidge, years after Jefferson died, recalled the heyday of flower gardening at Monticello, and she recalled how the whole family would go out together in the fall and plant tulips and hyacinth bulbs. And Jefferson was older then. His job was to space the bulbs apart and to label them as they were set into the ground. The daughters did the actual planting. And Jefferson's granddaughter was young at the time, and she recalled how the varieties of tulips and hyacinths had really colorful varietal names. They were named after classical heroes. There was Julius Caesar and Marcus Aurelius, the Queen of the Amazons, Psyche, and the God of Love. And she recalled planting the flowers in the fall and then waiting through the long winter and seeing the foliage of the tulips coming up out of the ground in March, and then all of a sudden the miracle of these flowers opening up in April. And she recalled how she would run to her grandpapa to announce that she really believed that Marcus Aurelius had risen from the dead, or that the Queen of the Amazons had come up from the underground. She talked about how the whole family would go out together and marvel at the colors and the combinations and the contrasts. And she said, oh, these were happy moments for us and for him. So Jefferson used gardening as a way of relating to friends and family, neighbors, and even political allies. He used plants as a way of building friendship and building community. The vegetable garden was restored in the early 1980s and late 1970s. We used archaeology to confirm a lot of the documentary information. We found a